Hello everyone, my name is Skylar Swiderski. I am a tutor for the Cisco 1 and 2 classes and a variety of other IT classes for SSC. In this online lecture, I will be talking about IPv4 addresses and how to subnet Class A, B, and C addresses. Before I start the lecture, I highly recommend that you should be comfortable with binary to decimal and decimal to binary conversions. I also suggest if you're not comfortable with basic foundations or concepts on IPv4 addresses and bits to go back and review them before starting. In the video, I will go over steps of the conversion, so if you're having trouble with it but generally understand how it works, then I highly suggest to pay attention to steps I am talking about in doing said conversions. This video should help you understand how to subnet IPv4 addresses as well. The video goes over concepts that will help you on upcoming assignments and exams. This is not only an important topic in Cisco, but also in IT in general. Variable length subnetting is not included in this lecture. In this video, I will be doing a step-by-step example and a do-it-yourself example. In the step-by-step example, I'll be going over the problem in detail, going step by step. In the do-it-yourself examples, I'll show you the problem. It is suggested in the do-it-yourself problems to try it on your own to see if you truly understand the concept of IP classes and its subnet. After a couple of moments of showing you the problem, I will then show you the answer and then summarize how it was solved. There will be checkpoint questions in between each of the three sections to further assess your knowledge. And lastly, after I finish going over the final IP class in the lecture, there will be some final ending questions to see what you've learned. I hope this video makes you more comfortable dealing with subnetting problems. This is a difficult topic in this course. However, with enough practice and studying with this subject, it will get easier. Without further ado, let's begin. IPv4 Class C addressing and subnetting. Please make sure that you have the Subnetting Network Practice document up for reference. In the document, looking at the top section, it goes over the IP information table and its formula. In the IP table, it goes over class type, ranges, subnet mask, and its prefix notation. Underneath the table is a formula that we'll be using quite often, which will determine the number of networks that would need to be created by the number of bits that would need to be taken. Hopping down to the first example, which is dealing with Class C address. Class C address, remember, is one of the most smallest classes in the IPv4 realm of addresses. In a Class C address, you can only have 254 hosts versus a Class B, which is slightly over 65,000, and Class A 16 million. Each of the classes have different subnet masks, which again determine what network bits are on and off, and etc. So in this step-by-step problem, it tells us that you are a network administrator and designer for a small graphics company. The company is currently needing a network to be set up. The IT manager has assigned you the task of creating the necessary network in its IP table. The IT manager got the address from the company's ISP. The ISP accidentally gave the IT manager the binary network address instead of the decimal network address. The IT manager said that you should be able to translate the binary address to the decimal form. The binary address is 1100.001.01101.0101111, and the rest are zeros. Assume whatever the class address may be, and it contains the default subnet mask for that class. It says that we'll be needing 6 networks what the problem asks us to do is to convert the binary address to decimal, subnet it by filling out the IP table, and answering the 5 questions. Moving to step 1, before we can even do any subnetting, we have to first convert the binary address to decimal. Remember that each bit represents a number. The first bit 128, second bit 64, third bit 32, etc. And when all the bits are turned on, it represents 255, the highest number that you can do in 8-bit sections. Each octet, or 8 bits, when added with the other 3, equals 32 bits, which is an IPv4 address, because an IPv4 address can have up to 32 bits. It can never be bigger or smaller than 32 bits. In an IPv4 address, there's 4 octets, because each octet equals 8 bits. When bits are turned on, it signifies that it is a network bit. If a bit's turned off, it means it is a host bit. Now, since we know some background knowledge on bits, now we can work on the actual conversion. In the first octet, we have 128 turned on, 64 turned on, and 16. Because those are turned on, we get to add those numbers accordingly. And that gives us 208 as our first octet number, our decimal octet number. The next octet has 32 turned on, 8 turned on, 4 turned on, and 1. We add these up, and it gives us 45. The next octet has 64 turned on, 16 turned on, 8 turned on, 2 turned on, and 1. We add these together again, and that gives us 91. And since the last octet is all zeros, the decimal version is 0. And now, since we have all of our number octets, we simply just put them together to make a complete 32-bit IPv4 address. In this case, the IPv4 address is 208.45.91.0. Because now we have the decimal version of the network address, we can now determine what class it is. In this case, since the first number, which is 208, falls into the range of 192 to 223, it would be a Class C address. Which, how do we determine that? If we go back to the top section of the document, it has the range right here, 192.223. Alright, since now we know what the class is, that will tell us what the subnet mask and the prefix notation is. Because it's the Class C, it has the subnet mask of 255.255.255.0 and the prefix notation of 24. Why? Well, since each octets, at least 3 of those have 255, that means that 24 bits are turned on. Remember, when bits are turned on, it signifies network bits. So we have 3 octets, each having 8 network bits turned on. And the prefix notation equivalency of a octet being all bits turned on of 255, the prefix notation would be 8. So 8 times 3, again, would give us 24, prefix notation of 24. Since now we know the subnet mask and prefix notation, now we can start actually beginning to subnet. Before we begin subnetting, I will show you another way of representing a subnet mask, which is called the NH format. The NH format represents a subnet mask by using capital N's, lowercase n's, capital H's, and lowercase h's to represent what type of bits are turned on and off. In this case, because it's a Class C address, we have 3 octets that have all bits turned on. So since all the bits are turned on, we give it a capital N, representing that all the bits in that octet are network bits, and there is no bits in that octet that are turned off, which represent hosts. The last octet, because it has no network bits and is all host bits, represents a capital H. But when we begin to subnet, since we're going to be borrowing from the host section, we will be then using lowercase n's and h's in the appropriate octet. So by default, the Class C network address and NH format equals capital N, capital N, capital N, capital H. In order to know how many bits we're going to be stealing to determine the sub-network addresses, we need to know how many bits we need to take. It told us that we needed a total of 6 networks. So we are going to be using 2 to the n to find out what gives us a minimum of 3. We can go over a little bit, but we don't want to create too many networks. Just enough. So if we did 2 to the 1, which means we only took 1 bit, that only gives us 2 networks. If we took 2 bits, we would be getting 4 networks. If we did 2 to the 3, that gives us 8 networks. And we did 2 to the 4, that would give us 16. Which number is the most closest to 6? The answer would be 8, because if we only did 2 bit stealing, we would only get 4 networks, which is 2 less than what the minimum is. But if we did 2 to the 4 by stealing 4 bits, that gives us way too many networks that we have to deal with. So the best answer would be taking 3 bits. So we're going to have 2 extra subnetworks. Representing this in NH format, we still have the first quadrants or octets that are all network bits, so the first 3 n's stay the same. However, we no longer have a capital H because we took 3 bits from the host section, turned them into network bits, and added 3 network bits to the 24 other network bits. So now we have 27 network bits, and the rest are host, which 27 would be our prefix notation, because remember, /24 was the default for Class C. But now, how do we determine what the decimal subnet mask is? Well, in order to determine that, we need to take a look at the number of bits that we're taking. So in this case, we had to take 3 bits, which, again, the 3 bits were 128, 64, and 32. When added together, we get 224. That's decimal equivalency. So our new subnet mask would be 255.255.255.224. Because again, we were modifying or borrowing bits from the host section. Now, since we have the subnet mask, the network address, and the prefix notation, and the number of networks that we're going to be creating, we can now work on the subnetting part, the IP table specifically. In the first part of the IP table, we're going to be working on the first and second columns. In the first column, since we're creating 8 networks, number it accordingly to 8, because that is the number of networks we will be doing. Now, the next column is the actual sub-network addresses. Because we took the 3 bits, we have to take a look at the last bit in order to determine what the subnetwork addresses are, how they increment, what is their actual address number. Well, since we took the last bit of 32, they'll be incrementing by 32. So the first subnetwork address would be 204.45.91.0. Because remember, we're not going to be messing with the first 3 quadrants here, because all the bits were turned on, and we were only modifying the last quadrant. The next subnetwork address will be 204.45.91.32, because they're incrementing by 32. One question that you may be thinking is, well, what is the last subnetwork address? You determine that by your subnet mask. What was the number, the decimal number of your subnet mask? The quadrant that you messed with. So in this case, it was 224. So your last network will be .224. And the reason that is one, the subnet mask will tell you the network, the last network anyway, but the real reason is you cannot have a network that goes past 255. Because remember, when all the bits are turned on, that's the maximum number that you can get, the maximum decimal number that you can get. You can't go over 255. So fill out the rest of that column accordingly, and we'll move on to the next step. Next step is creating the first available host address. This part is very simple. We simply just add 1 to the last quadrant here. So in this case, our first available host for the first subnetwork would be .1, because it would be 204.45.91.1, because we can't give a PC or any end device a subnetwork address. The next one, the next subnetwork would be .33, because we simply just added 1 to the subnetwork address, and do the rest accordingly. Now, since we have the third column done, we can work on the last column, because in my personal opinion, doing the last column is easier than trying to work on the next column after the first available host address. Until you start getting a hang of it, of knowing how things get incremented or de-incremented, this is the best way to make sure that you don't make any mistakes. So we're going to be working on the last quadrant, which is the broadcast address. And remember, a broadcast address sends all the information that was sent to everyone in that network. So not one person, not a small group of people, everybody in that network. So in order for us to know what the broadcast address is, we simply just subtract 1 from the next address. So what I mean by that is if we're trying to figure out what the broadcast address for the first network, we go to the second broadcast address here and we subtract 1. So this would be .31, the fourth number here. And the next one after that would be .63 because again we subtracted 1 from the next one. And always in most cases here, the last row, the last network will end in 255. Because remember, you can't go past 255. So fill out the rest of the column accordingly, and then we can move on to the next column, which is the last available host address. In the fourth column, the last available host address, this is very simple. We simply just subtract 1 from the fourth octet number, and that will be our last available one. So in this case, our last available host address for the first subnetwork would be .30. And the second one will be 62. And in the last row, it will be .254. Fill out the rest of the column accordingly. Now, if you notice that in every column, in the fourth octet, each of the number increments by 32. So, looking here, the second column, remember it was incrementing by 32. But now let's test the other columns. 1 plus 32, 33. 33 plus 32 equals 65. Let's go to the next column. 30 plus 32, 62. 62 plus 32 equals 94. Next column, 31 plus 32, 63. 63 plus 32, 95. Whatever octet that you had to do subnetting for in Class C, the fourth octet will increase always in the column by that bit number, unless it was in variable length subnet mask, which we're not going to go over in this video. Alright, so that concludes the step-by-step Class C example. Throughout the problem there, we talked about the answers to those 5 questions. So now we're going to go over to now you try problem for the Class C address. Alright, so I suggest you to try this on your own and see if you can come up with the correct answer, just to see how well you're doing with the problem type, and then I'll talk about the answer and give a summary of how we got to that answer. So I suggest pausing right now to work on the problem. Alright, well I hope that you worked out the problem and filled out the IP table and answered to the best of your ability what the questions are for this. So in this problem, we were given a Class C network address with its appropriate subnet mask and prefix notation, and we had to create 12 networks. Now, this is a little bit more networks than the other one, but again, same principles apply. Remember, in the other one, we had to steal 3 bits, which gave 8 networks. Well, in this case, we had to take a little bit more bits, because if we only took 3 bits, it only gives us 8. So we had to take 4 bits, which gives us 16 networks. Now, again, our subnet mask, our decimal equivalency, remember, we have to add up each of the bits. So in this case, remember, the 3 quadrants stay the same, but now we're going to be getting a new 4th octet number. It's no longer going to be 0 because we're messing with the host portion. we're now stealing or borrowing bits and converting it to network. So we took 128, 64, 32, and 16. And that is going to be 240. And remember, again, whatever the decimal number is here, that will be the last subnetwork address. And since we took the 4 bits, the last bit that we took was 16, it increments by that number. Increments by that number, 16. So looking here, it starts at 0, next one 16, 32, etc. ends at 240. And broadcast address, subtract 1 from 16, 15, subtract 1 gives us our last available host address, add 1 to 0, we get our first available host address in the table. Double check your work, make sure that it looks more exactly like this. This is the correct answer. The answers to the questions, well, again, since we had to take 4 bits, our subnet mask was .240, which is equivalent to 28, because remember, our base subnet mask was 255.255.255, which is equivalent to 24, right? Because 24 bits are network. We simply just added 4 more network bits to it, so it's 28. Subnet mask, remember, 255 equals a capital N, so we have 3 capital N's. And now since we took 4 bits from the host section and made it network, we have 4 N's and 4 H's. So we only have 4 host bits now. Since we had to take 4 bits and we only needed 12, but again, since 2 to the 4 equals 16, we had 4 extra subnetworks. So we had 16 total subnetworks from subnetting the network. What is the subnet address that the host address belong to? Well, since 194.200.78.201 belongs to a certain range, we had to compare it. So 201, looking here, 194.200.78.193 to 206. It's closer to the last available host address of this range, so it belongs to the subnetwork address of 194.200.78.192. And remember, because whatever it increments, so in this case, each subnetwork increments by 16, we can only have 14 hosts per subnetwork. Because, remember, that 16 includes the network address and the broadcast address. So it's not taking into account on what actual usable hosts that we can implement into the network. So, in the previous example, we used, I believe, the last bit of 32. So that meant each network was only able to actually use 30 hosts. So keep that in mind, that hosts are always subtract 2 from the bit number. All right, so now we've just finished part 1. We are now going to move to part 2. But before we can do that, we need to answer some checkpoint questions. So please take the time, pause the video, answer the questions to test your knowledge, and we'll then move on to part 2, which is subnetting Class B addresses. Alright, so now we're going to begin Class B addressing in subnetting. And we're going to begin this with a step-by-step tutorial. So again, Class B is very similar in the principles and concepts of subnetting. Just some slight variations on when it comes to the IP table. So in this case, you are a network administrator and designer for a medium-sized graphics company. The company is currently needing a network to be set up. The IT manager has assigned you to the task of creating the necessary network and its IP table. The IT manager got the address from the company's ISP. The ISP accidentally gave the IT manager the binary network address instead of the decimal network address. The IT manager said you should be able to translate the binary address to the decimal form. The binary address is 1010.1011.0000000, and the last two octets are all zeros. Assume whatever the class the address may be, it contains the default subnet mask for that class. In this case, the company is asking for 4 networks. Your task is to convert binary address to decimal, subnet the given address by filling out the IP table, and answering the questions, which the questions are the same from the previous examples. So remember, Class B has more hosts, has a different subnet mask, so it's going to be slightly different from a Class C network. So, but as always, before we can begin subnetting, we have to convert that binary address to decimal. So we're going to start with the first quadrant here, the first octet. We have the 128-bit turned on, the 32, the 8, the 4, and the 2. Because remember, they're turned on. They represent the bits that we're going to be having to use for the subnet method. But in this case, it's just the network decimal equivalency for the network address here. So in this case, it would be equal to 174. The next octet would be, well, we need to take a look at our bits here. Again, we have 128 turned on. We have the 32-bit turned on. We have the 16-bit turned on, and all the rest are off. So this, in this case, it equals 200. The next bits for the next quadrant, well, they're all zeros, right? None of them are turned on. So in this case, the decimal equivalency would be 0 for the both of the quadrants here. So now we again, like we did in the previous examples, we combine the two, combine all the octets together. 174.200.0.0. So now we know the decimal equivalency. And because now we know the decimal equivalency, now we can find out what class it is. Well, because we're working in part 2, which is Class B, that's self-explanatory. But if you did not know, again, you need to know the ranges, which is, again, in this document, it is at the top. 174 falls into the range of 128 to 191, so it has to be a Class B address type. And because it is a Class B, we know the default subnet mask. Remember, because the first two quadrants are network and the last two are host. So it will be 255.255.0.0. Because remember, 255 represents that all the bits are turned on, and when bits are turned on, it is network. And the prefix notation would be 16, because remember, each one represents 8. 8 bits are turned on, times 2, because we have 2 octets that are containing 8 bits each that are turned on. And the NH format, again, for this is, remember, when we have all bits turned on for network, capital N, and since the last two octets have all the bits turned off, represents hosts, so capital H, capital H. In this example, we need 4 networks, right? 4 networks the company needs. Well, how many bits do we steal? Well, we'll do it like the way that we did it before. Again, if we only take 1 bit, we only get 2. But in this case, if we take 2 bits, we get 4. That's exactly the number that we need. In this case, the company doesn't have to worry about extra networks being created. We have a number that we can work with, and it creates the exact amount of networks that we need. Because we're taking 2 bits, again, we're leaving the first 2 octets the same because we're not stealing from those 2 octets. We're going to have to steal from the last 2 octets. Remember the 16, but we have to do it in order. In order for us to get to the 4th octet, that means that we would have to steal 8 bits, but we're not going to having to steal 8 bits. So we're going to only be borrowing the host bits from the 3rd octet. So we know that the 4th octet in this case would still be a capital H because all the bits in the 4th octet would be still turned off. But we will be having to steal the bits in the 3rd octet here. Because we're stealing 2, we have 2 lowercase h's and the rest are lowercase h's here. So 2 lowercase n's, 6 lowercase h's. Now we know how many bits we need to steal, but we need to know now what the decimal equivalency is. What is the subnet mask? Well, again, we just add up the bits. So right now we know the first 2 octets are going to be 255.255, and the last one is going to be .0. But since we took 2 bits, remember 128 plus 64 is 192. So our subnet mask now would be 192 for the 3rd quadrant. So 255.255.192.0. And since we took 2 bits, remember, since the base one was 16, now it is 18 because we took 2 bits from the host and added it to the network bits. Alright, now we can actually do this actual subnetting for this. So it's slightly different again, but don't worry, not a lot is going to be changed. It's just the different placement of the octet numbers. So in this case, since we're only creating 4, we can number the first column, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then now, instead of the increment number being in the 4th quadrant, because we were borrowing bits from the 3rd quadrant, we're going to be putting the subnet number, the 3rd quadrant number, accordingly. So in this case, remember, the first subnet address will always be 0. So 174.200.0.0. Next one will be .64. Why? Again, 64 was our last bit that we took, right? Because we took 2 bits, 128 plus 64. And 64 was our last bit. Again, the last quadrant in this case will be .0. Next one will be 128. And how do we know what our last network is? We look at the decimal equivalency, which was 192. So our last one will be 192. And now we have our second column filled out. We know where our subnet addresses are, and now we can work on our first available host. Well, remember how we did it before, that we just simply added 1 to the 4th octet? Well, same principles apply, because when the 3rd quadrant is giving the information on the network. Now we're just simply telling what the host section is. So in this case, .1, so it'll be 174.200.0.1. Next one will be 174.200.64.1, and etc. So the first column here, the 4th octet of every number in this column will be the same, because they all start with 1. Now we're going to go to the broadcast column, the last column, because remember I said until you start getting the hang of the increment numbers, it's best to make sure that you're correct and thorough. Though it does take a little bit more time, it is the best way to make sure that you don't get anything wrong. So in this case, remember how we subtracted 1 from the previous example? So if I remember right, the first example, which we took the 32-bit, and it was incrementing by 32, and we subtracted 1 to get the broadcast address, which was .31 for the first subnet address network. We'll be simply subtracting 1 from the third quadrant. So what that means is the broadcast address will be .63. And remember, in this case, the last quadrant is dealing with the hosts, and since we didn't steal any bits from the last quadrant, we can have up to 254 hosts, which means that our broadcast address will be .255. So, and the next one would be 127, because again, we subtract 1 from 128, and then our broadcast address will be .255, and this is the same. So again, the fourth column here for this column will be the same. So the next one will be 191.255, and the next one would be 255, because can't go over 255, and again, it is incrementing by 64. So take a look at it. Notice that in the third quadrant here, and this will be the same for the fourth column here that we're about to do in a second, it will be also incrementing by 64. So 63 plus 64 gives us 127, 127 plus 64, 191, etc. All right, so like the previous problem that we just subtracted 1 from the broadcast address, well, same principle applies, except we're not subtracting 1 from the third octet, we're subtracting 1 from the fourth octet. And the third octet number stays the same. So 255.254. This one, 191.254. All these will have 254. Notice the substantial host pool in this. The first network begins at 174.200.0.0 and doesn't end until 174.200.63.255. That's a big host pool compared to the previous problems, where when we did subnetting the Class C networks, you had less than 254 hosts per subnet, obviously. But in this case, we're going to have more than 255 or 54 hosts per section. All right, and that is our IP table. So that goes over the details of the steps there. I hope that was pretty straightforward. Same principles, just a little bit different. Now we're going to do now you try. So get ready to try it on your own, see how well you do. And in a moment or so, I'll talk about the answer briefly, but again, it will be in general sense. All right, so pause the video now and begin working. All right, I hope that you worked out the problem and did the questions accordingly, filled out the IP table as best as you could. So again, this problem is pretty straightforward. We were given a Class B address, decimal form, so we don't have to worry about converting it to decimal. We were given the prefix notation, which is the base prefix notation for that class, so we know that the subnet mask by default is 255.255. And in this case, we need 7 networks. Well, if you remember right, that a couple examples before, that 2 to the 3 gives us 8. That's the closest, but just to show you, if we did only 2 to the 2, that would only give us 4. And if we did 2 to the 4, that would give us 16. So this is 2 to the 3 is the most closest one. That satisfies the minimum requirement, but does not go significantly over the network amount. So since we took 3 bits, remember 128, 64, 32, equivalent to 224, and incrementing by 32. As you can see here, each of the first network would be .0.0, 32.0, and just make sure that you did the subtract 1 from the broadcast address, add 1 from the network address to get your host, first available host, and answer the questions there. Again, remember our subnet mask was, to start out with, was .255.255, but since we had to subnet the third quadrant here, that gave us 224, and the fourth quadrant stayed the same. And since we had to steal 3 bits, 16 plus 3 gives us 19. That's our new prefix notation. Since we had to take 3 bits, again, in the NH format, we kept this the same, capital N, 3 lowercase n's, all the rest are lowercase h's, and then we have a capital H because the last quadrant was not messed with. And the next question was how many subnetworks were created. Well, we got 8. We had 1 extra subnetwork. And what subnetwork address does this host belong to? Well, looking at the ranges again, remember in this case it was .78.47. It would fall into the third network address because it fits into that range. So it would be 145.40.64.0. Alright, well that concludes part 2, the IPv4 Class B addressing and subnetting. But before we move on to part 3, the last class, we need to do some checkpoint questions just to make sure that you truly understand this section here. So begin working on this section. Take your time, and then we can work on the next section here. So good luck. Alright, well, this is the last section of the video, which is Class A addressing and subnetting. We'll be learning how to subnet a Class A address and be able to fill out IP table and do problems accordingly. So again, Class A address has about 16 million hosts. Class B had 65,000, and Class C significantly lower, 254 hosts. So just like Class B, the number adjustments where we place the numbers will be slightly different. It will be off by a quadrant or octet, but the same principles and concepts apply. So in this case, you're a network administrator and designer for a large graphics company. The company is currently needing a network to be set up. The IT manager has assigned you the task of creating the necessary network and its IP table. The IT manager got the address from the company's ISP. The ISP accidentally gave the IT manager the binary network address instead of the decimal network address. The IT manager said that you should be able to translate the binary address to the decimal form. The binary address is 001100001. And the last 3 quadrants are the same, which are all zeros. Assume whatever the class address may be, it contains the default subnet mask for that class. So in this case, the company needs 7 networks. Your task is to convert the binary address to decimal, subnet the address, by filling out the IP table and answer the following 5 questions. So again, before we can really do any of the subnetting part, we have to convert the binary address to the decimal address. So moving to the part 1 here, step 1, we will be converting the octets. In this case, we only had to work with the 32, 16, and the 1-bit, which add up to be 49. And because all the other octets are the same, which are all zeros, our address is 49.0.0.0. Well, because it is 49, the first number, we know that it's a Class A address because it falls into the range of 1 to 127, which really, in this case, remember that Class A really technically ends at 126, and 127 is just a loopback address. It just is a returning address, but 127 is still a Class A address type. But anyway, 49 does fit into that range, so it is a Class A address. And because it is a Class A address, it has the subnet mask 255.0.0.0 and a base prefix notation of 8. Because the first section here, 8 bits, all network bits are turned on. The last 3, no network bits are turned on. Which again, in the NH format, capital N. In this case, it is 3 capital H's. So now we can go into begin the subnetting part. So we need to know how many bits we're going to be needing to steal to get at least 7 subnetworks. Hopefully not more. Ideally, we want to get the exact amount, but that's not always the case, as we've seen. So in this case, the most closest one was 2 to the 3, right, which was 8. Because anything lower, we didn't meet the minimum requirement. Anything more, that gives us way too many networks, and the company doesn't want that many networks at the time being. So what is the decimal equivalency, the subnet mask? Well, again, 3 bits equals 224. Remember, 128, 64, 32, 224. And because we had to take 3 bits, and our prefix notation was /8, our new prefix notation is /11. Now we begin to fill out the IP table. The IP table, again, slightly different, but same principles apply. We, instead of keeping the first 2 octets like we did in Class B, that we won't be changing. In this case, we will only be making sure the first octet stays the same. The other 3 will be different. So, network number, well, fill out that accordingly. We're creating 8 networks, so number that 1 through 8. Subnetwork, well, just like same principle, same concept, like Class B and Class A. 49, the first number, 49, 49. But in this case, since we're incrementing by what number, we took the 32-bit, the last bit. The first subnetwork address will be .49.0.0.0. Next one will be .32.0.0, and etc. So just fill that accordingly. Add 32 to each of it, and remember what our last address is, 224, because of the subnet mask, and you can't go over 255. The first available host, well, in this case, our first available host would be on the very last quadrant here. So 49.0.0.1. Next one would be 49.32.0.1, and accordingly. So the last two quadrants in this case are going to be the same for this column, 0.1, 0.1, etc. And each of these columns, the second quadrant will be the same, and the first quadrant will be the same. And they're both getting incremented by 32 here. So 32, 32. All right. Now we go to the broadcast address. Well, in this case, remember like the class B where we had 255 as last? It's pretty close. So again, we had to subtract one from I believe it was the third quadrant. But in this case, we're subtracting from the second quadrant. So it would be .31. We have a full broadcast, right? And then we have another full. So these last two quadrants here in this column will always be the same. In this case, it would be .63, .255, .255, and etc. So fill that out accordingly. Remember, subtract one from the second quadrant, and then the other two quadrants will be the same. And in the fourth column, you just simply subtract one from the last quadrant here. So, you know, in the first row, it would be .31 here, 31.255.254. Because we simply just subtracted one from the broadcast address, the fourth octet. And that's how you do Class A subnetting. It's just different octet placements on the numbers. Same principles, slight variations. All right, so now we're going to go to now you try Class A address here. And let's see how much you know, how much that you may need to work on, and good luck. So just pause the video, work out the problem, and then I'll go over the answers and give a little summary on how it was accomplished. All right, well, I hope you filled out the IP table and did the questions accordingly. All right, so we are given a Class A network here, and the base prefix notation. So we know that the subnet mask would be 255.0.0.0, and in this case we'll only be creating 4 networks. So what does that mean? Well, we're only going to be taking 2 bits because 2 to the 2 equals 4, and if we only did 1, that will give us less, and if we did more, that would be giving us more. And because 2 to the 2 gives us the exact number, we're going to be using that. So there's no point of grabbing more bits. Because we took 2 bits, 128 plus 64 equals 192, and that's our decimal equivalency. So it'll be 55.192.0.0. What is our prefix notation? Well, it is because since we had 8 bits, because it was a Class A network, we simply just add 2 because we took 2 bits from the host and added it to the network side. It is now 10. And our last network, again, will be 192. So it's incrementing by 64. Last address will be 192. So looking here, 90.0.0.0, 90.64.0.0, etc. We added 1 to the last quadrant to get the first available host. We subtracted 1 from the broadcast address to get 254. And that is the IP table. The second quadrant is always incremented by 64. The last 2 quadrants in each of the columns are the same. Alright, that concludes part 3. So now, let us work on the checkpoint questions. Please take the time to answer the following questions. Good luck. We are moving on to the ending. Please take your time on working these out. This goes over Class A, B, and C topics and concepts. Pause the video, work out the problem, and we'll move on to the next question. In this section, there will be 5 questions. All right, the next question. All right, that was questions 2 to 4. And the last question is question number 5. Alright, well, this concludes this online lecture. In this video, we discussed the concepts and ideas of the 32-bit IPv4 addresses. We also discussed how to subnet IPv4 addresses based on the class types. I like to remind whoever is watching this lecture to make sure that they truly understand this topic. It is going to be a frequent item that will appear in assignments, chapter tests, and your final and midterm exams. Not only in this class, but other future Cisco classes if you decide to pursue it. If you have any questions or concerns dealing with IPv4 addresses or subnetting, I suggest either contacting the tutors for this class or your professor. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, feel more comfortable with subnetting with IPv4 addresses. Until next time, have a nice day. Thanks for watching.